Hello and welcome. I'm Octavius Obe. Today we are looking at the War and Economic Crimes Court in Liberia, and joining me is someone who's very able to discuss that. James Nyepan Verdier is former chair of the Liberia Anti-Corruption Commission, national officer for the Justice and Security Program at the UNDP in Monrovia. He was also program manager for rule of law at the UNDP as well. He's formerly assistant professor of law at the Louis Arthur Grimes School of Law in Monrovia and head of the Catholic Justice and Peace Commission. And he got his LLM, I believe, from the Notre Dame School in Indiana, the Fighting Irish, and his first law degree from the Louis Arthur Grimes School of Law in Monrovia. James, how are you doing today? Welcome.
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me, Octavius. It's good to be here, and I want to say hi to our viewer and listening audience. I look forward to having a very intelligent, fruitful, and productive discussion surrounding the different topics and issues that you will be highlighting.
And of course, just to give out our audience a synopsis, we'll be looking at jurisdiction, witness protection, collaboration with existing institutions, public perception, a multiplicity of issues really surrounding the War and Economic Crimes Court. But let me begin at the most obvious place to start, James. You were in the running, but ultimately you didn't get the job to be on the War and Economic Crimes Court in Liberia. How did the process go? What happened?
Well, thank you. The first thing is that what drove my intention to put myself in the running for that office, in my view, is very obvious and personal, because I really believe that I'm one of the most qualified professional to actually deliver the World Economic Crimes Court to Liberia. My graduate program was specifically on humanitarian law, human rights law, dealing with transitional justice specifically. So I thought, based on my experience in my professional training, I, if not the most, was among the most qualified. Because of my passion about transitional justice in Liberia, about assisting and supporting the process to bring healing and justice to hundreds and thousands of Liberians based on what happened and during our crisis, I thought it would have been a good service to Liberia for me to be involved. Unfortunately, I was not the person selected. The process, it was a very good grilling process. The scrutiny, the recruitment process was good. There was a long interview with me, I think for an hour, 30 minutes. And I thought the questions they set up was good. And the three names were finally sent to the president, and the president, in his wisdom, chose another colleague, Councillor Jara Babu, to do the job. I may have had my own misgivings, but I respect the process. I respected the process at the time, accept it, and we remain very available and supportive, to the process, because at the end of the day, we are very interested in making sure that Liberians can experience that opportunity to bring closure to most of the trauma, the hurt, the grievances, the victimization. We hope that Liberians will have the opportunity to do that, and we remain supportive of that process.
So let's come to the meat of the matter right away. Let's begin by looking at jurisdiction. How is jurisdiction derived or arrived at for a War and Economic Crimes Court in Liberia? What is the legal basis?
In most cases, when you talk about jurisdiction, you talk about where the abuse or the crimes were perpetrated. Yeah, where they were perpetrated. Okay. And in the case of Liberia, obviously, we had a civil major rights conflict for multiple years, up to 14 years or more. So all of those things took place right on the soil in the territorial jurisdiction of Liberia. So that gives the Liberian government any venue that is established, that gives it direct jurisdiction, because the abuses you're going to be, are alleged abuses and crimes that you're going to be hearing actually occurred in Liberia. So the Liberian government, the people of Liberia, whatever venue judicial venue that is established, in this case, we're talking about war crimes court, definitely have natural jurisdiction, natural and legal jurisdiction.
So let's look at the scope of the court. Some have argued that perhaps it would be better to delineate, to separate war crimes from economic crimes. What do you think is the justification for merging the two? Is that a much better idea than separating them?
Well, I think basically if you are consistent with if not all, a portion of the TRC report, they also reported on economic crimes during the war. And that was the extraction of mineral resources, agricultural resources from Liberia during the war, just to promote the war. And that is that portion that is really associated with economic crimes while the war was going on. I think the intention also is because Liberia has severe illness. Liberia is struggling with the issue of corruption. I think the idea is to establish an economic crimes code that will metamorphose into a permanent anti-corruption code. But in terms of the war crimes, there are economic crimes that have been, the mining resources, the gold, diamond, the logging. Those natural resources were used by elements of the war to support and perpetrate the war against and the crimes against the Liberian people. So that's why it's important right now when you're looking at the war crimes, that economic crimes is also in economic.
So let's look briefly at some political considerations surrounding the court. And the most current pressing issue right now is the passing of Senator Prince Johnson. Do you think that will have an impact on the workings of the court? And if so, to what extent? Because he was certainly a major player in the war.
And that is a very, very, very critical, and obvious question, obvious but critical question. And I think as we proceed with this discussion, with this activity, I would say that we have more discussion rather than interview kind of thing. So, let's discuss the different implications of why I'm responding to the different questions. Prince Y. Johnson in the certainly has for a long time been the face of any war crime initiated. And I think it was basically because of the amount of atrocities, the amount of egregious crime that he was associated with and he was alive. So he's been associated with every effort to establish the war crime. This should not cut short the importance of other elements in Liberia who themselves perpetrated the war and perpetrated crimes against the Liberian people. There are several other people who the TRC report actually documented. The general this, the general that, the general this other person. So many persons, Prince Johnson was the easy target because he was very visible in every era of the war, from the time he broke away from Charles Taylor and then established the Independent National Patriotic Front, taking over Monrovia, and then the fact that he, away from the battle scene, away from the war front, was in the communities in Liberia, Bushra Island, and was physically seen shooting at people and killing people, unarmed civilians as well. So yes, he was the face of the war crimes movement, but that doesn't mean that it has come to an end. When you prosecute people for war crimes, it's not only people who were commanders and who were all people who were soldiers, people who acted on the command of military leaders as well. Civilians themselves, committed on war crimes. So there are a whole group or a category of people who should actually be brought to justice for perpetrating the crimes against the people of Liberia. It's not just Prince Johnson.
So let me piggyback on the phrase you use, brought to justice. I know these are concepts you are absolutely familiar with as well. Retributive justice versus the other various forms, some of them, and how do we account for some degree of forgiveness and reconciliation and all of that?
You see, when the people in the country and community go through crises like what we experience, a huge portion the fabric of the society of the country is is troubled. People are traumatized. People are hurt from the killing of relatives, loved ones. Sometimes the process in which people are treated, they're tortured. People both scars from the torture for life. Some people are disabled because of that. But it's also important for the community or the people of the country to come together and decide on how they want these abuses and these incidents to be addressed. Because if you proceed, if the government just decides a path of prosecution, the government will engage in a long-standing, stretched-out effort to prosecute people, because when a conflict lasts over 14 years, you bring all facets of the society of the country into play. Some of the reasons why people were hurt were for tribal reasons. Some of the reasons why people were abused and tortured were for economic reasons, and some were for political reasons, some for religious reasons. So it touches a vast scope of things that led to somebody experiencing something during the war, whether a person was arrested, whether relatives were killed, whether relatives were forcibly recruited, child soldiers were recruited from homes and thinking, whether they were used for sex, and all of that. It cuts across. And to address this so that the country moves forward, you need a country to come together, which the TRC actually honored to decide on what could be the process of healing. What would be the process of us addressing this thing? Of course, with the critical element remaining that when people commit crime against society, against individual, it is not safe, it is not advisable to let them go scot-free. Because you also set the basis for the future to let people know that these are acts that we're not going to condone. They can be inhumane, they're uncivilized, and all of that. So that's why we had that experience with the TRC going from county to county all around and going into the diaspora, going to the United States, going to Europe to talk to Liberians who were affected, convening town hall meeting, and to discuss the way forward. Now, when we talk about discussing the way forward, everybody's situation, every country's situation may be different from others. So based on their experiences, people came together in different countries and decide what could be the process in terms of healing. For example, we use our neighbors, Sierra Leone. We look at South Africa. They decided the process. We want to approach this in South Africa. The government realized for decades of armed struggle, against the apartheid regime, it was difficult to be able to just prosecute everybody. So the government brought people together, and they were able to express their pain. They were able to voice where they were hurt, and they were able to discuss how it would benefit them moving forward. They wanted to know who was responsible for their relative disappearance. In Chile, there were a lot of disappearances. People, relatives just disappeared. But just grabbing Pinochet, the former leader, and just executing him would not have resolved those kind of things. They wanted to know where their relatives were buried. If they would disappear, what happened to them? And providing some information as to what really happened, how their lives were ended, brought some closure to some people. So it is with South Africa. They brought them together, and then they had that meeting, and they were able to confront each other. Middle of January, they confronted each other. Victims, confronted the perpetrators, and there was reconciliation. Some people apologized and they cried about it, and they were able to resolve most of those things. And those who were found to be the perpetrator of a grievous crime, okay, we can prosecute some people, but we just can't prosecute everybody. So in the case of Liberia, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So in the case of Liberia, the TRC took on that mandate to go and discuss what could be the process for reconciliation. How do we want to approach the abuse, the wrongs that we suffered during the war? And from the reports, majority of Liberian people were talking about war crimes.
And so it's sort of normal and easy to talk about bringing people to justice, right? And that was my mindset for a very, very long time. And it still is that to a certain extent. And here is a certain extent. I once heard President Paul Kagame say that The people who kill our relatives, our family members cannot bring the dead back. And for the society to move forward, the bulk of that weight rests on the shoulders of the victims.
Yeah.
And that shocked the crap out of me because I was thinking that, we just need to grab these guys and try them, put them in jail. Even in there was a point in my thinking where I believe we should have them executed, but not anymore. But when he said that our people cannot be brought back and for us to move forward as a society, as a people, most of that rests on the shoulders of the victims. That blew my mind. Do you think as a society we are ready to even consider that point of view, or are we still heavily on prosecuting people?
Well, you remember the TRC had interviews in Liberia where they invited a lot of former war crimes, so former warlords, to discuss their role in the war and all of that.
Correct.
Because that was the process that was initiated for healing. There are some people who went to the TRC and actually confessed their role and asked for forgiveness.
Yeah.
They explained how they got involved, that they themselves were victimized, and some of them were forcibly recruited, or some of them were faced with circumstances where they had to take arms. They explain all of that. If you go back to the TRC report, all of those statements, those admissions were reflected in the recommendations that the TRC made about those who should bear the full weight of the law, those who were categorized as committing egregious crime against the people, and those who should be pardoned because they were able to admit, they apologize, and ask for forgiveness and all of that. So I think the Liberians will have come to a place after the whole TRC process where a majority, not all, but majority of people believe that bringing perpetrators to justice through a war crimes thing is the way.
And for people to come and testify and speak out against those who perpetrated these heinous crimes, there has to be some degree of witness protection for them, right? How far will the court or should the court go in allowing for that and being able to protect these people? Because at the end of the day, we all still have to live in Liberia, right?
Good enough, when I was at the LHCC, during my administration at the LHCC, we succeeded in putting through the legislature a witness protection law that gives the state the responsibility to provide the protection for people who will be testified against very serious crimes, especially in corruption. I think that can be used as well. So we do have a witness protection law in Liberia. And that can be used, but it also requires resources. I can tell you that at the LSCC, we had to move one of our witnesses outside of Liberia. Had to move our witness to Ghana for protection. So it requires resources. And the War Crimes Court, when established, we had to find the resources specifically designated to protecting witnesses, people who want to come forward. That has to happen because there are some people who are going to be very uncomfortable even facing the alleged perpetrator in court. They're going to be uncomfortable doing that. You got to also establish an in-camera sitting where people will come away from the public and will have private hearing. So perpetrator may not want to be identified at that point in time. I mean, the other people, the witness will not want to be identified. So you do an in-camera and take statement from them and all of that. So all of those things have to be put in place. They will contribute to the quality of prosecution we'll have if that prosecution process starts.
So what about institutional collaboration? Of course, the court cannot and will not and should not operate in isolation. It has to work hand in hand with other institutions on the ground and perhaps international institutions. The Supreme Court is on the ground. Of course, we have the whole executive, the political establishment. What's it? Identify some of the organizations and bodies that the court will need to collaborate with and talk about the nature and the extent of this kind of collaboration.
When the court is established, before it is established, I think the organizers who are setting up the court will have to liaise and work with a lot of civil society organizations. Civil society organizations have better, closer, quicker reach to evidence and to people as compared to the government institutions that will be established. So that relationship with civil society is very important. Human rights organizations are spread all across Liberia, and they have people who have either witnessed or documented some of those abuses. And some of them will know where the witnesses are or where the alleged perpetrators are. And so that collaboration, that relationship is very important. Regarding the code, when the code is established, you will have a prosecutor, and it will be the responsibility of the prosecutor to reach out to those people. The code is not going to come out and start looking around for people to identify, for witness and all of that. It's the prosecutor who will bring all of these people together. So the prosecutor is a critical, very critical person. The prosecutor will have that link and that relationship with the community to reach out to people, to get witnesses and all of that. That would be very important. Civil society organization, I would say, would be, the best bet. In terms of funding international organizations, all of that, you have to, because we've seen a situation where a process was started and midway it had to be shut down because of lack of funding. We continue to protect witnesses. You got to procure evidence. You got to make sure you also protect the accused. You're bringing them to secure them in terms of detention, where, and all of that. So there are a lot of things that are involved that require a lot of finances. Government will have to work to secure the finances. That responsibility cannot be transported over to the prosecutor or the court. This is a government initiative, and government has to demonstrate this interest in this and its commitment to it by making sure that resources are allocated and set aside for the court, to operate. And that is where also you have international organizations and multilateral partnership with countries involved. We're not going to just look at the U.S. alone, but most countries in Europe are also interested in this kind of process, in bringing people to justice, for crimes committed. So European countries, the government can use its bilateral relationship with countries to also seek funding to support.
So public engagement and public perception are also two important components of any undertaking such as that. There are certainly things the court will have to do to engage the public. What are some of those things, and how do you think, given your experience, the court will or should engage the public to impact perception of their work?
So when you speak of the court, you are speaking generally of the war crimes court. But specifically, we'll be talking about the prosecutor, because you're not going to have the judges who will be engaging the public. No, you're talking about the administration of the court, and yet definitely they will have to reach out. Like you mentioned on the issue of public perception. If the Liberian people do not believe in the court, if they do not trust the court process, they're not going to cooperate. So the first thing the administrators of the court want to do is to make the court visible and make the ideas, the working of the court likable to the people. Let them understand. So you have to do real public awareness. Let them understand what the court is about. Let them appreciate that the court is not witch hunting. The court is addressing issues of crimes, issue of retribution, issue of punishment, for egregious crime committed against the people of Liberia. So that public awareness and acceptance of the court will be crucial to the success of the court. Because if the court is not accepted, it's not saying as an entity or venue that Liberian people want to go to the look to for justice, for reconciliation, all of that, then they're not going to support it. They will end up cheating the very people that you'll be trying to look for. So that would be a responsibility of the court administration. Will have probably a research team, a public office, a public relation office, and other things. They will have to do that even before the court gets started. Liberian people have to know what the court is doing, and they got to accept it. If they don't accept it, they themselves will undermine the workings of the court, and that would be a effective bill.
So that public perception and public engagement also ties in somewhat neatly, because if the court or the prosecutor can get the public to, I don't want to say side with, but to understand the workings of the court, that will in turn impact reconciliation and long-term peace building, right? Wouldn't it?
But the people too have to understand that reconciliation is not just only victims and perpetrator confronting each other and somebody say, I'm sorry, and please forgive me. There are just some crimes, some conduct that are so outrageous. They are so egregious that you just cannot tell the man and say, okay, since you did this, I forgive you. As a matter of fact, there are international laws that prohibit a country from pardoning or just forgiving somebody who commit war crimes against people. You prevent it from doing that. So the country itself does not have the fact that Liberia is a member of the international community and has signed all the human rights treaty. And the Liberian government cannot come and say we pardon this man for mass murder. You can't do that. You are prevented. You are precluded from doing that. So we have to bring this man to justice. When somebody is brought to justice and they are found guilty and they serve some sentence and in good, then the country can move forward and pardon. Another important thing to mention is that when you're doing a war crimes court, this usually involves an extrajudicial process. As a matter of fact, the executive order that was signed by the president also clearly outlined that
And let's start
extrajudicial proceeding.
something like that. But that was bringing me to my next question, really, in terms of the role of Supreme Court, that executive order that brought the War and Economic Crimes Court into existence. And let's even talk about the ECOWAS Court. How does the War and Economic Crimes Court fit into that legal in Liberia and West Africa?
Yeah, the first thing is we still don't have the law establishing the court. We have an executive order that expires sometime this year that actually authorizes the president, and the president also authorizing. There's an act passed by the legislature by the Senate say, please go ahead and organize the war crime court. The president used an executive order to get the court started. Say, why don't you start this court? But there has to be a law. There has to be coming from the legislature and creating the war crimes court. We've not got to that point yet. This office of the war crimes court that has been established now, that is now headed by Councillor Jala Babu, this office has to work with the legislature to actually create a law to establish the war crimes court. So when that court is established, then we start looking at the different things that the court should be doing. So the court is not established yet. You want to have an office charged and clothed with the responsibility of organizing, making sure that court is established. And that has to be established through an act of law. So there has to be an act from the legislature establishing the War and Economic Crimes Court. I'm going to say when that happens, or what that is happening, there are certain things that we need to look at. The court cannot be subjected to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court.
I was going to ask you just that because best case scenario, that court comes into existence. Does it operate outside the purview of the Supreme Court?
Certainly.
Okay.
That's what we call it extrajudicial. It will not be submitted to the confines of the Constitution that talks about all courts are inferior to the Supreme Court, and pleadings or cases getting out of this inferior court will go to the Supreme Court for final hearing. No. This is a court that will be away from the Supreme Court. It will have its own appeal process. So you have a trial bench and then you have the appeal bench. Because if you submit it to the Supreme Court, then you actually nullify the existence of that war crime court. But the Constitution says there will be no other court higher than the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the highest arbiter of justice in Liberia. Because of these crimes that were committed, you want to have an extra court because the processes of our court system are so backlogged. You cannot submit war crimes court into the regular courts. And then these cases of crimes are not emanating in the Supreme Court. They emanate in a trial court. So if you go to a trial court, then you're going to subject them to this long process, years and years and years of litigation. And then when you announce an appeal, it goes to the Supreme Court again and take years. I still have a case. When I serve as LCC chairman, we have a case that we prosecuted with former police inspector general Muna C and others. The Supreme Court took more than 7 years to actually decide that case, even after the final argument. So, like, I'm just giving you an example. So you can submit a war crimes prosecution thing to the Supreme Court. It's an extrajudicial thing away from the Supreme Court. For example, you saw you remember the TRC report, and in the TRC report it says, and remember now in the TRC law says that the governor of Liberia shall, it didn't say will or should, it says shall, made it mandatory, shall implement all recommendations of the TRC report. The TRC came up with this report, recommended a ban and exclusion from politics of Madam Salif at the time. What happened? The Supreme Court went and came and said, "Oh no, you can't ban, you can't stop her from participating in politics because you didn't give her her day in court." You know, they say every citizen is supposed to be a judge to have that day in court, and they should go through the appeal process. So the Supreme Court blocked that. This is just an example of what happens if you submit.
That's not going to obtain in this situation though, because
that is why the law says expressly that this is an extrajudicial hearing, and it's not going to be submitted to the conference of the Constitution and the Supreme Court. It's an extra constitutional action that is being taken to address the issue of victimization, the issue of reconciliation, all of that. So the Supreme Court will be far away from this one.
So is it not a sort of a mild contradiction, though, that you have a structure in Liberia that's not subject to the authority of the Supreme Court, but yet when it comes to enforcement, I'm sure they will rely on local instruments, right?
Yeah, it has to. I don't see it as a contradiction because, like I say, this is outside the normal confines of the law. The things that are happening, our Constitution is structured to operate on a normal existing situation, not in war. Constitution is not the Constitution was to address the issues of war. What happened? It was organized. It was structured to adjusting or normal behavior in society. So because of those abnormal things happening, you have to adapt a constitutional way to address them, or else you're going to spend the next 55 years trying to address those issues through the constitutional means. You can't do that. And these efforts to address reconciliation, retribution, all of that, they should be actually subjected to a definite duration. They can't go on forever. You got to look at 5 to 6 years to address abuses in war crimes. After 5 6 years, you're done with that. That's what all the countries we're talking about have done. West Africa, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Burundi, Chile. You give a particular set of time, definitely time duration. In 4 years, we address the issue of war crimes. After that, we move on. So the court is definitely going to have a duration. After that, it ceases.
In these situations, does the court or should the court have power to levy sentences posthumously? In other words, if somebody has passed, but that person is adjudged to have committed heinous crimes, can the court or will the court be able to say something? Or
I would think that would be considered. Personally, this may not be akin with my training as a lawyer, but personally, after the perpetrator has passed, and I don't see the need of the posthumous, but it's just history. Because it was documentation that this act, even though the person had passed, but this act that was committed was wrong, and the person would be sentenced for even though the person had died. Well, you can do that. That's just for documentation, and that's for generation after to know that the certain conduct, were just not tolerated and they were against the laws. Whenever you do this, I don't care where you're coming from, this will be the law.
So when people talk about war and economic crime, naturally the focus tends to be on those who actually fought the war, the combatants. What about those who actually purchased arms and brought those arms to Liberia and they themselves did not fight? Unless you're willing to persuade me, I've made the argument previously that maybe a warlord got in a plane, went to Saudi Arabia, negotiated with Adnan Khashoggi, went to I believe Ukraine or Russia talked to Victor Bout, loaded those private planes with arms and ammunition, evaded international security, evaded Israeli intelligence, evaded American intelligence, evaded intelligence agencies in the Arab world, Nigeria, and landed in Liberia, and then started the war all by himself. Then I think we should also look at the people who purchase arms. There are others. Should we look at these people who did not hold the guns to fight, but were involved in one way or other in bringing the war to Liberia? And how should the court handle that?
But I think that was the basis for the TRC at the time, recommending that Manasedi and others, be barred from participating in politics. It was not Manasedi alone, there were several others. But I'll say this, people who, in all the scenarios that you named, involved in trafficking, avoiding or evading international security, different country security, those are conscious and deliberate acts, on their part. They can be prosecuted for that. It depends on the country. You identify those people and you make a claim to their country wherever they are. Ask for them to be brought to Liberia and be prosecuted for that. You can do that. Country, you just need to spend some more resources, and then it depends on the bilateral relationship with this country, because the act was committed against Liberia, but some of the acts did not happen in Liberia, so they could also stand trial in their country, in the country of airspace where it happened, where the international traffic law was violated. They can be prosecuted for that. But you need to identify those people, build that relationship with those, the criminal justice system in those countries, and say we want to pursue these people for the wrong they committed against Liberia. That can happen.
I thought about making this next question I'm about to ask the first question, but I changed my mind later on. We seem to be obsessed, those of us in the South, developing countries, with this whole idea of war crimes and bringing our people to justice. But there are certainly countries in the world, you are aware, that the United States and Britain went to war in Iraq under false pretense. We now know that it was completely made up and trumped up, and that country was destroyed. And nothing has been done to anyone from either of those countries. Why should we be so focused on this when in fact it's happening other places and nothing is done to the leaders of these countries, to the people who carry war to these countries?
Well, that's a responsibility of the people in those various countries. One thing we should remember is that it's not because the United States did something, it's right. The United States has a lot of laws that protect its citizens and protect itself. That is why you have the United States did not sign the International Criminal Court Treaty, because she didn't want her citizens to be, tried by that court. She did not want to come under the jurisdiction of that court. But I would say this to people. I think the United States for several years lost that moral high ground, being the police of international morality, and against criminality, because a lot of crimes are taking place in the United States, and she does not prosecute her as well as she's supposed to. So it doesn't mean that's right. The issue of the war in Iraq, we all know about how the reasons for intervention were made up just because there's somebody who they fear as a dictator was a threat to world peace, and the United States was basically making that case. The Arab world didn't see it as such, but they made that case to intervene. There can be a lot of reasons for intervention, but in the case of Liberia, with the war against the Samido regime, it quickly seemed to have lost focus and turned to victimizing, common citizens. And there was some conduct, some acts were done deliberately, without any fear. Those are the kind of things we want to make sure that actions can be taken against people who did that. Or it can be documented that those conduct, no matter where they take place, are just not conduct that we can accept. They violate international law, they violate our domestic laws, and people have to come to terms with those things. This kind of scenario is present in every country, be it United States of America, any country. Even in Rwanda, there are a lot of things that are happening in Rwanda And the people are saying, look, we are going to move forward with this because we don't see the value of going back to do the moving forward. That's a decision that people have to make. But if it is the leadership making that decision and forcing it down their throat, then there's something wrong with it. So there's never a clear path to reconciliation. There's never a clear path for any country coming out of civil conflict where people have a lot of lives have been lost. There's not a one cap fits everybody. There's a one cap, one side kind of situation. People have to make that determination based on their own circumstances and decide how they want to move forward. So even if the war crime code is established in Liberia, somebody is being prosecuted for a specific wrong, and the victim comes to court and say, I've forgiven this man, I want the country to forgive him too, that could be a plea. But if the act borders on crime in the country, violates the criminal code out of that, and that person has to be prosecuted, even though the victim has forgiven that person. But the act and the conduct is against the sanctity of society. That person has to be punished for it.
You mentioned variously the workings of the erstwhile TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. At the end of their work, they published findings. Should that be, or will that be, or can that be brought into evidence with the War and Economic Crimes Court? What's the nature of any relationship between the work of the TRC and the War and Economic Crimes Court?
That could constitute the basis for proceeding, but the prosecutor will have to do more investigation and will have to gather additional evidence. But the TRC report will be the basis for them. And I'm sure also that the TRC was able to amass some evidence that is stored somewhere. If they can get all of the evidence which they will be trying to do, I'm sure they'll be protected somewhere. They're going to use that. Most of the evidence are documented. They will use that, but I don't think a prosecutor will depend just solely on the TRC report. A prosecutor will have to send his own investigator out, and do some investigation, and to either clarify or confirm some of the evidence that the TRC was able to gather. So the prosecutor office will involve investigator, will drop criminologists, people who will be digging and looking for evidence here, and we engage the community to identify victims. We work with the community to identify the perpetrators as well. So there's a lot of work to do, but the TRC report could form the basis for prosecution going forward.
I'm sure there must be international best practices out there, examples from other countries that we can follow without going into the minutiae. Name one or two countries that have handled this process very well that could serve as an example for Liberia.
Our next one, they were Sierra Leone, they handled it very well. South Africa handled this very well. There's a country in East Timor-Leste. Timor-Leste did the same thing, and then in Timor-Leste, they established a war crime code and an economic crime code and embedded it within one of these agencies. And gradually, the economic crime code became permanent code, and the war crime code was just for 2 to 3 years, and it was finished, but the economic code remained, to corruption. So we have a whole lot of evidence in Tanzania as well, where different courts were sitting. The Gacaca, remember the Gacaca movement in Burundi? People were saying, what? There's too many people were involved in our war. Burundi and Rwanda. If we're going to prosecute people, we might well be prosecuting the entire population because people from all facets were involved. So to have all that responsibility, let's organize the traditional code and people come together, sit down, and they identify people and people talk. So they sat down on the floor, on their palaver house and everything, and people explain their stories. And by doing that, people forgave some, and the others who crowds were so great. They said, okay, we can forgive this man, that they can prosecute this man. The community agreed. So okay, we prosecute this man for this, but for this other man, we forgive him and do that. So like I was saying, the community that has been affected, that have been victimized, people come together and decide how they want to move forward. This is not just a determination for the leader, for the president or the minister of justice to say, this is what we're going to do. You have to see, what do you all want to do? And that is what the TRC was doing, calling on people and asking them. The TRC put together a report based on this massive consultation it had all over the country and outside the country. And at the end of the day, they say majority will say they want the war crimes code. So that's where we are.
So in terms of a time frame now, how early or when do you think the code will actually be up and running?
In my estimation, if I was in a position to head the war crimes code, I would say first thing is that there has to be a law establishing the war and economic crime code before the executive order expires. The executive order has a 1 year life duration. After 1 year, it ceases to exist. So the president can go and issue another one, but that will not be, I don't see the efficacy in issuing another one. So before this executive order expires, there should be an establishment of the war and economic crime code through an act of the legislature. I think, I believe that's what they're working on right now, to make sure that this law is passed before May or June, establishing the code. Once the code has been established by law, then all of the other things will go into place. And in my view, I would think that prosecution through the war and economic crime code should end with the Barker administration. The first 5 years or 6 years should not go beyond. They should be able to end within 4 to 5 years. You do everything and make sure that you identify those who will also be prosecuted. You have the trial, and everything ends within 5 years. If it goes beyond that, it loses the esteem, it loses the strength. People are not going to be as interested as it is again, and so you just want to make sure that it's stay within time and people can concentrate on it and support it. So it has to have a short-term duration, After that, then you have the economic crime code that will just go and remain a permanent anti-corruption code. That is the important thing of this. You want the economic crime code to be established, because one of the problems we've had is that we also complain that our courts inundated with huge backlog, and you don't want to subject cases of corruption that have become so chronic into the same process. Because
Regular court
the
system.
only way you're going to stop it, people, and we've not done a good job at it yet. Even under my tenure as NDCC chairperson, there were a couple of people we prosecuted, but we wanted to prosecute more. But we were restricted because of the conditions of our court structure. You have a case and it takes you 5, 6, 7 months just to come for one hearing. So you don't want to subject cases of corruption to that because it's chronic. You need to prosecute people for corruption. You need to have them in jail, or you need to, whatever the punishment is, so that the Liberian people will see that this issue of corruption that we're thinking to be cold water and thing is the normal thing in life to do, to request money from people or to convert public resources to yours. We need to prosecute people for that. So you want a code that will fit this process. And once
on
you
a continuous
do that,
basis.
Yeah, on a continuous basis. Once you do that, we did with the rape code. They established a special SGBV unit to get the cases arrested, but then send them to the rape code. Do you know how the issue of rape is slowly declining in Liberia? It's slowly declining.
That's
People
good.
decline
But
possible because you have a code that is dedicated to it and is prosecuting people for it.
let me take you out of the legal realm. That's that area, as you say, in Liberia, and bring you into let's look at some non-legal considerations, right? Psychological considerations, therapeutic considerations. As a society, I believe we're clearly traumatized. Should the court have some look back or some consideration for non-legal areas, or should it just focus on the legality alone and that's it? Or what are your thoughts on those non-legal considerations?
I think you have the government as a whole. The government should look at the process holistically. So the prosecution on the war crime code is one aspect of restoring a nation.
Yeah.
So you don't want to have the war crime code responsible for providing psychological healing or doing therapy. You don't want to have the war crime code. The war crime code is sort of focused on prosecuting people who are being accused of war crimes. And the value that brings is that you prosecute somebody and then you send a message of deterrence, and then they have the opportunity to be corrected, so that in jail, whatever term they're serving, they can come to a realization that my conduct was wrong, and I will be a different person if I come out after. That's the basis of the justice system. In terms of the psychotherapeutic study, you want to have a Ministry of Health and Social Welfare, or the Ministry of Health, and another organization, another agency that will address this issue of the war and provide healing and reconciliation. You don't want to put all of that on the war crime code. So you have people from Ministry of Health who would deal with the psychotherapy. You can actually get the services of psychologists and other people who we have some prominent Liberian like Dr. Bangladesh who is doing psychotherapy here in America. These kind of people can help. That is an area too that we can't ignore. So while you're prosecuting people for the crime, you also providing support to heal the victims, as well as others, to do that. I think we have to look at it holistically, and that's a responsibility that the government has to execute.
James Nyepan Verdier, former chair of the Liberia Anti-Corruption Commission. He worked with the UNDP in several capacities: Justice and Security Program, Rule of Law Program, former assistant professor of law at the Louis Arthur Graham School of Law, and let's not forget, Catholic Justice and Peace Commission. Thank you so much for bringing a lot of light to this important topic for our country today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Otavio. It was a good discussion, and I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Thank
You're
you.
most welcome.